In this lecture, we'll talk about forms, then form controls, which are input fields, then labels, field sets, and legends. Then we'll talk about how to style a form. Then we'll talk about HTML5 form controls, and then form processing. So just so you know exactly what a form is, a form allows the users to input data and send it to a website. And so this is a form that has a first name and a last name, and we'll go ahead and submit Mickey Mouse right here. And now we see that Mickey Mouse was sent to a page right here where we can process this. Now this class won't focus too much on the processing. That's more for advanced classes that includes a lot of programming. But this class will teach you how to create the form in the first place. So I have created a page here. I have a head section with a title called form, and I'm not going to include all the different sections in this page. I'll just have a div where we can put our form tag in there. So to start a form, you start with the form tag, and you close the form with the closing form tag, and all of this data will be sent together to the page that you go to. You can have more than one form tag on a page. A form tag does have some required attributes. One of them is the action. And if you notice, when you submit a form, you go to a new web page. So it's a lot like clicking on a link. When you click on a link, you go to a new page. When you submit a form, you go to a new page, and the action is what page you want to go to. So I'm just going to call this formproc.php. And later on in this video, we'll understand why I'm naming it .php instead of .html, but this will just be another page that will submit our data to the page. And there is one more required tag, and that's the method tag. If you don't put this tag in, then the method will default to a GET request. And then there's also a post. So I'll show you the difference between a GET and a post in a little bit, but now we'll go ahead and start adding fields into our form. These fields are added by inputting in a form control, and the most common form control is a text input, so we'll go ahead and put type equals text right here. We also need a name attribute. The name is what we're going to call this field, so we'll go ahead and do a name right here. I'll leave it all lowercase. So I know this is a little redundant, but I'm calling this field a name, so I want someone to input their name, and we'll go ahead and label that so they know what they should put in this field, like that. And then we'll add another input, which will be a button, so they can submit it. So we'll call this type submit right here, and I'll put a line break between the two. And we'll see our form right here. So now we can go ahead and put a name in here, and we'll just put Fred for now. And I can click this button and submit it. So next we can add some other fields, like an email field. And we'll use text for that. Now we'll call this one email. So hopefully now you can tell the difference between this name and this name. This is the name that refers to, this is a name that I want, and then the name here says what is the name of the field. So this field is named email. Go ahead and put a line break, and then we'll also have a password. And we can use password, so there is a password field. Just like that. And then when we see this, now we have Fred with an email and a password, just like that. And so the email I could fill in as fred@fred.com, and I'll give it a password. Now watch when I submit this. Now I haven't created the page that we're going to. If you notice, there's no formproc.php. I haven't created it, so we won't get an actual page. We'll get an error. But if we look at the top of our URL, we just went to formproc.php. And that was with the post request. Now let me show you if we do a GET request instead. So we'll go back, refresh, and make sure that this is a GET request. And we'll submit it. And now if you notice that my URL still says formproc.php, but now after the URL I have all of my field names right here and the values of whatever the person typed in the field. So the name was Fred, and then we have Fred at fred.com, and finally we have their password, which I put in as Fred. And if you notice, there's an ampersand in between each one right here. So when you do a GET request, the information goes into the top URL, and if you do a POST, if the method is a POST, then the information doesn't go in the URL. It still gets sent, but it gets sent a different way. So for most forms, you probably want to do a POST request, especially if you're taking a password in, because the user probably doesn't want to see their password up here in the URL, like you've seen here. So you'd usually do a POST request. The one exception to that could be when you're writing a form for a search. So when you're searching the web, then that could be a GET request. And the main difference between a POST and a GET request is a POST request changes something on the web server. So if you're logging in, you're changing your status on the web server, so that's a POST request. If you're registering for an account, that would be a POST request because you're creating a new account. But if you're just searching, you're not really changing anything on the web server, you're just asking for more information to read. So it's a read-only request, you're not updating or changing anything on the web server. So that's the main difference between a POST and a GET request. So now we'll add in some more fields using different types of form controls or different inputs that we can use. We'll do a radio button and a select box and a text field and a checkbox. So I'm going to snap my fingers and put all of those in. Alright, so I've added in a gender field, and so we could select whether we're male and female using a radio button, a checkbox to agree to terms and conditions, and a select box to select our state, and a text area to enter in multi-line comments. So let's go see how this looks, and here we go. We have our name, our email, our password field, and then we have a radio button or two radio buttons to choose our gender. And if we choose one and then select the other one, then we shut one off and turn the other one on. So only one of these can be on. And then we have an I agree checkbox right there, a select box to choose our state, and any comments that we might want to have. And with this, we can have more than one line. Press enter, add another line down below. So let's cover each one of these fields one by one. First of all, we have the radio button, and if you notice, there's two inputs for that, one for the male and one for the female. I didn't put a line break after this, and that's how I get them both on the same line. And if you notice, the name is exactly the same. So both of them are called gender, but the value right here that we put is different. So this value is male and this value is female. So even though we have two inputs, we'll only send one value, either male or female, based on what they checked. So that's the radio button, and we do have to be careful. These names do have to be the same. If we make one of them different, then our radio buttons stop to work. And if you notice, we can select both of them and it won't toggle between the two. So you do have to have the names be the same for that. And then if they're the same, then they can toggle. Next we have the checkbox. It's just type equals checkbox and the name right here, and it says I agree. And then we have our select box right here, and so we put our different states in here. And this value is optional. If you don't mind this being the value that you send to the web server, then you can leave this value off. But if you want a different value sent, like the 2-letter state code, instead of the full name of the states filled out, then you can add the value in. The users will not see these values, they'll see these, but when they submit, these are the values that get sent right here. So that's the select box. And then finally, a text area is the one input that has an opening and a closing tag on it. And you add the name attribute to the opening tag, and if you notice, the select box has a name as well. So you add the name to the opening tag right there. And then we have the closing tag. So next, let's focus on making this form look a little bit better and styling it up. And one thing that we can do with the form is we can add a field set around all the form elements that we want to add it around. And so if we save that and refresh, what that does is it puts a nice border or box around all of our fields. Of course, we can, with CSS, make the border disappear if we want to, but basically this is a set of fields. And then up at the top, we can also add a legend. And I will say register, just like that. And let me make sure we have all of this indented right. Like that. And now our legend up here says register for a new account right there. So there's our register, our legend. And then another tag that can help us style up is a label tag. And we can put the labels around the text that labels what our field is. So this label tag right here it says that this name is a label. Now, a lot of time, one thing that we need to do is connect this label to what input field that we're labeling. So how we do that is we add the for attribute, and we put name right there, and then we also have to add an ID right here, name. So this ID is just like the other IDs that we can use to style up this name field individually, and it has to link up. If you're using a label tag, you have to link it up that way. And so I'll snap my fingers and put label tags around all of these. So now you can see that I've added an ID onto all of my fields here, and then a label with the for. So now email matches up. This is the label for the email field, and then we have the password, which is a label for the password field or the password input. And then here I did something different on these two lines for the radio buttons. I took the label tag and I surrounded the entire input inside of it. So the beginning label tag starts here, the ending label tag ends here with the label inside and the field inside. When I do that, the label tag knows that it's labeling the input inside of it, so I do not need the for attribute on this case. And that's the same with the female radio button, and I did the same thing for the checkbox as well. I could do the same thing for all my other labels as well, but I've also showed you the other way to do it, and so I return back to the first way of doing it. So this is for the state, and I have an ID state right here that links those two up. And then a label for the comments right here, and an ID on my text area for the comments. So once I do that, I shouldn't see much of a difference at all. So why even put the label tags in there? For two reasons. First of all, when we're creating an HTML page, we want to describe our document. So that this text right here is best described as the label for this input right here. The second reason that I put it in there is it will help us style up the page better when we go to use our CSS right here. Now before we do the CSS, there's still a couple more things that I want to do. First of all is our input. If you notice, it says submit query, where we can put a value on this and say register right there. And instead of saying submit query now, it says register right here. One other thing that you can do with the form to make it look a little nicer is add a placeholder. And this is just a little hint text. So we can add on all the text boxes, or the type equals text. You can add a placeholder attribute. And I'll just put your full name, and we'll see that. And now we can see some text right here that gives a little hint, and then you know that Fred should also put his last name, Jones, like that. And once they start typing, the placeholder disappears. So that will only work on the newest browsers. So if someone with an older browser loads up your form, they won't be able to see the placeholder. So it is a little bit risky to use that as the label, to just put name inside of there, because older browsers won't display it. And they'll just see a blank text field and not know what to put in that field. So before we go to style this form with CSS, I did want to cover how we can have this form pre-filled in with some information. So I'll go over each of the fields. For a text field, we can always put a value here. And the value I'll put just be Freddy, like that. And so when I refresh this page, you see that it's already pre-filled in with Freddy right there, and so whenever someone loads this page, it will become preloaded. So you could do that for the email field and the password right there. And then maybe you already want one of these radio buttons selected. Let's say we want the mail one selected. Then on that one, you can go put checked equals checked, like that. And so that when we load the page, the mail one starts off as checked. And that's the same thing with the I agree. We can put checked equals checked, like that. And then the I agree will start off as checked. And for the state right here, let's say that we already wanted Hawaii to be selected. So we could go selected equals selected, like that. Put quote marks around the second selected right there. And then when we refresh, we see that Hawaii starts off as being the one selected. Now notice they're still in the same order, it's just Hawaii is the one that's been selected. And then for pre-filled in comments, you just put in some text here. That. And now you see the text shows up in here. Now, one thing to be careful about with this is the text area beginning and ending tags. If we, say, put a line break in between it, like that, and we refresh, if we notice my cursor starts already over here, because all that space that we put in between those two text area tags will show up inside on here. So always put the two text area tags right next to each other without any space in between. Now because some of the lines are wrapping over, I'm going to decrease my text size right here so it fits all of them on one line. That way you could see how it looks right here. And finally we have the value equals Freddy up here that got wrapped around on the other line. Now I'm going to go ahead and style up this form to look a little bit nicer. The first thing I'll do is I'll add an ID onto it. So I'm calling this the register form, and then as you can tell, I've linked in this form.css style sheet. So I'll go ahead and start styling it up, and we have the register form right here, and I can style up the field set, which wraps around all of that, and I could give this a background color, and I'll just do a nice light gray color like that. And then we have a light gray color. Another thing I can do is I can style up the legend. And I'll give it a background color. And this is a light blue color. So we'll have a light blue right there. And then I'll also change the color of the text to make it white. And I'll also change the font family to Arial Sans Serif. And change the font weight to be bold. And the font size to be, say, 16 point. And so that does that. Next, when these text boxes right here, then they don't kind of align, it's still okay functional wise, but it will look a lot better if we could get all of our text boxes to align. So to do that, I'm going to add a div tag that wraps around the label and the input. And I'm going to snap my fingers and do that. Alright, so I added a div with a class called form row, and that surrounds my label for my name and also the input. Also, a little note, I took off the line break here because the div class is a block element, meaning it will take up the full line. So by taking away the line break, I didn't need the line break anymore because the div class will make sure the next div class goes in the line below. So I surrounded email with a form row as well, then password, and then I have a radio row. So I'm going to style these radio buttons a little bit differently than my form rows. I'm going to also style up my checkboxes the same way. Both of these I'm just calling radio row, and then I have a for row for my select box right here, another form row, and then I have a text area row for my text area right here, and then a submit row for my submit button right there. So each input is surrounded by its own div tag. And now we can go to style it up with CSS, and I'm going to snap my fingers and do that. Okay, so I've added these two right here. So the form row, I've added a top margin, a top and bottom margin, and that's just separates out my fields a little bit so they're not right next to each other. And notice I left the left and right margin to 0. And then for the label inside of the form row, I float it to the left and I clear it at the same time, and that just makes sure that the next label goes underneath it. Then I assigned it a width, and then I text aligned the text to the right and put some padding on the right to separate out the fields like that. And so there's our labels, and if you notice now all of our text boxes are horizontally aligned. That also aligns it with Hawaii, the state right there. So now let's go ahead and move these. Let's get some margin in between them so they're not right next to each other. Let's also move them over so they align with the text boxes. So I'll snap my fingers and do that. So I added this right here. I just added a margin on the top to 10 pixels, and the margin on the right is still 0 pixels. The margin on the bottom is 10 pixels. The margin on the left is 100 pixels. So the 100 pixels moves the radio button over to line up with the text boxes. Now I might need a little extra space there to make it look exactly lined up, and there we go. Now we get them all lined up. So that's with the radio row. Now let's get this form field fixed. And first of all, this is a pretty small text box, so one way to make it bigger is in the text area right here, we can add a rows, and we'll have 7 rows, and we can also add a columns, and we'll have 50 columns, and that makes our text box a little bit bigger. Now if I were to move this one over, it would it's not necessary. You can decide if you want to do it or not, but I think it looks fine just the way it is. Now one thing that we could do with these text inputs is we could round the corners, make them a little bit bigger and nicer. So I'm going back to my CSS and I'll snap my fingers and do that. Alright, so I added these two right here for the form row, and I'm styling up the input tag. I added some padding, which will give me some more space around the text, border radius, which will round the corners, and then I added a background color, which will color the background a little bit differently. And then I used the pseudo class focus. Whenever somebody has their cursor inside of the box, it'll change the background color back to white. So I added this effect right here, and when I put my cursors in different boxes, you could see the background color changes. We also have a little bit of padding around this so the text isn't right next to it. And then I also rounded the corners. Now I can also style up the text inside of here. I can change its color, change its font size, change the font, and so on. And that's all I'll do for styling. There's a lot more that you can do, so make sure you go online or look at other forms to see what else you could do to style up your form. So the last thing we'll cover is processing the form. So when I click on the register button, right now it takes me to a not found, and remember we're going to formproc.php. So by the way, for this part of the lecture, you will have to put your HTML page on the web server. So if you're just doing it on your desktop and you put this formproc.php on your desktop as well, it will not work. So go ahead and upload your file to a web server, and then I am going to create this formproc.php. So I'll snap my fingers and create a new file. Okay, so I created a new HTML file, but I've called it formproc.php and not HTML, and that's really important. Another thing that's really important is you cannot do this if you're just working on your own computer. You do have to upload your files, the formproc and the form.html and the form.css. You do have to upload them to a web server in order for this to work, because your computer doesn't have PHP installed. It probably doesn't have PHP installed. So I've uploaded these to a web server, and now what we can do is we'll create a tag, and this is actually PHP, and you can read more about PHP online, but it's a programming language. And in order to process the form, we do need to have some sort of programming language. So what I'm going to do is print out all of the fields that were submitted. So we have the name right here, and I'll just put print and then $_get and name right there. Then we'll do a line break, and let's go see how this page looks. So we have Freddie filled out. We'll go Freddie Jones, and we'll give him an email, a password, make a mail, have him be from the state of Hawaii, and then we'll go put hello for the comments. And now we could see that we have the name right there, Freddie Jones. And also if we're looking at the URL, we're still doing a GET request. I never changed it back to a post. So that's why when we take the name right there. So let's go ahead and change the form back to a post. I'll snap my fingers and do that. And so now you can see I've changed the method to a post. So we'll go back to the form, we'll refresh, and then I'll add the password, and we still have hello in there. And now I'll click register this time, and if you notice that the URL, none of the values are there, and also the name doesn't show up. So going back to form proc, if we do a post request, instead of doing $_get, we do $_post, and then we get the name. And by the way, when you do a post, when you refresh, the browser will make sure you really want to make the changes again. So I'm snap my fingers and do all the rest of the fields. Okay, so I've added in the email, the password, the gender, agree, state, and comments. It's really important that this name matches up with the name on our field. So the name right here, the name right here, they have to match up. If they don't match up, you won't see that value. So we'll go back to form processing and refresh, and here is all of our comments. Now if you notice, agree says on. So if we go back, uncheck agree, adding the password again, click register, and now notice agree is blank. So if they don't check it, it's blank. If they do check it, it'll say on. Now once we get these form values on the form processing, usually what we'll do is we'll put them into a database, but that's beyond the scope of this class. So we can print them out in this class, and I'll teach you one more thing that you can do is you can email the values to a certain place, so that way if someone fills out a form, it'll send you an email. So I'm going to snap my fingers and show you the code that will do that. So what I've done here, and this is written in PHP, so what I've done here is this is a variable to be able to store a message that we want to send, and I assign it to be equal to the quote name, and this little period is a concatenation, so we're going to add the name from the post into our quote or our string, And this right here is a new line. It's like the line break right here, but this is for emails. And then notice the period right here. Don't forget that period, because that will add this string on to the end of this string right here. If you notice, the period right here concatenates the strings together. That's why there's periods there. That's why there's a period here and here. So you can add other fields that look exactly like this line right here. If we didn't have this period, then we'd erase this one and just have this one. And finally, we use the mail function right here. This is the address of where you want the email to go to. So this will probably be your email address. And this is the subject of the email that will get sent. This is the body of the email, which will be our string right here. And this is the from address that you want for the email. So once you do that, you submit, and it should send you an email of all of the information in your form. One additional thing we need to talk about are HTML5 form controls. These are new form controls in HTML5. And since they're new, some browsers will support them and other browsers might not. And each form control that I'll introduce here is a little bit different. So let's get started. I have a form here. I've started over with a new blank form, and I put a name field here, and it's just using the text input control. And I'm going to snap my finger and add in an email. So I added in this new field right here, and it's an email field. One thing just to note, to make sure you pass validations, if I haven't mentioned it before, is the for field should match up with the ID field in your input right here. Even if you have the name, you still need to add this ID, and that's how it will match up the label for the input. If you don't do that, then you'll get validation errors. But anyways, the type is text, so when we look at this field right here, then we still get a text field. But now we can change the type to email, which is a new HTML5 field, and it's going to look the same, but when I fill it out and try to submit, if you notice, it will say, oh, that's not a valid email address, and it will make sure that the email address is valid. So that's new in HTML5 right there. Now, if a browser doesn't support this new field, then it will default this back to just a regular text field. So that's the good thing is, if you use the new ones and a browser that comes along and doesn't support it, they'll still see the field and it will revert it back to a text field. So I'm going to snap my fingers and add in some more form controls. Okay, so what I've added in are these fields right here. I've added a phone number, a date, a color, and a number, a range, and some options with a data list right here. So I've added in all of these fields right here, and let's go see how they work. This is a Firefox browser right here. So we can see there's an email that we talked about before that's not correct. But now we have a phone number, and this should follow the format of a phone number. And if it doesn't, then it won't let us submit the form. We have a date, a color, a number, a range, and options. Now, as you can see, the Firefox browser doesn't support all of these. So there's nothing special about the date, the color, the number, or the options right here, or this range. That's because the HTML browser doesn't support it. But if you notice, it falls back gracefully to just text fields. So now let's pull up a browser that does support it. And this is Chrome right here. And it seems like Chrome has the best support for these HTML5 fields. First of all, the date right here. If you notice, we can pop this up and we can select the date sometime. You can also have a color picker. So when you do that, you can choose a color. And then a number with a little spinner up here. So that's the number field. And so how I got that to work, for the phone field, it's TEL, a type TEL. We'll make sure that this is a telephone number, but Chrome doesn't even support this one. So this one is unsupported in any browser that I have, but it might get supported sometime in the future. Then we have this date right here, and I've done that with the type equals date right here. And then a color is the type equals color. And then this number with this little spinner thing is a type equals number. And then a range right here. If you notice, I have the range. And I have the minimum of 1 and a max of 100. And so that gives us a little slider here, and they could kind of pick a range. And then I have this options right here. And notice it's just a type text, but I have a list attribute on here, and I tied up to list options. And then I have a data list right here. And notice the ID has the same, is exactly the same as what I have right here, which ties these options into our list. So when I click this down arrow, I have these different options right here. So those are HTML5 form controls, and you can start putting them into your web page. And as you can see, if a browser doesn't support it, it still will fall back to just a blank text field. But as soon as the browser starts supporting them, then they'll get these better ways for people to input them in.